The soldier stood at the edge of the marsh, where the reeds grew taller than a man, and he lowered his matchlock because his hands had begun to shake. It was near dawn. The mist sat low over the water. He had been ordered to watch this stretch of flooded ground while the rest of the column moved along the ridge behind him, and for most of the night nothing had happened. He heard the frogs. He heard the wet suck of his own boots. Then he heard something breathing that was not a horse and not a man, and it was very close. To understand why a hardened soldier would abandon his post over a sound in the reeds, you have to understand where he was standing and what had brought him there. In the 5th month of 1592, the armies of Toyotomi Hideyoshi crossed the sea from Japan and landed on the southern coast of Korea. This is documented history. Hideyoshi had unified Japan after more than a century of civil war, and he intended to march through Korea and conquer Ming China beyond it. The invasion force numbered in the tens of thousands. These were not raw recruits. They were veterans of decades of internal warfare, men who had seen sieges, massacres, and every ugly thing that soldiers do to one another. They were not easily frightened. That detail matters. Keep it in mind. The men who wrote about this campaign left behind a body of records. Japanese commanders kept war diaries. Buddhist monks who traveled with the armies wrote accounts of what they saw. Korean officials recorded the invasion from the other side, and the Ming Chinese who later joined the war added their own reports. From these sources, historians have reconstructed the campaign in remarkable detail. And scattered through these accounts alongside the battles and the sieges and the long, miserable marches are stranger things. Soldiers who described encounters they could not explain, creatures they had no name for. This is the story of one of those encounters. The soldiers moving through the Korean interior that summer were far from anything familiar. The land itself was strange to them. Korea in the 16th century was a country of steep, forested mountains, narrow valleys, and vast, flooded rice paddies that turned whole regions into shallow water in the growing season. For men raised on the terrain of Japan, some of this was recognizable and some of it was not. The insects were relentless, the heat was heavy, and the wetlands, in particular, unsettled them, because a wetland at night is a place where sound travels strangely and the ground itself cannot be trusted. Disease moved through the camps. Supply lines stretched thin as the armies pushed north, and hunger followed them. Men grew exhausted and superstitious in the way that exhausted men do. When you have marched for weeks through a hostile country, sleeping in wet clothes, watching your companions die of fever, your mind begins to fill the darkness with things. So when the reports began, there were reasonable explanations ready at hand. Fatigue, fear, the imagination of frightened men in a foreign land. But the accounts did not read like the ordinary fears of tired soldiers. They described something specific. The pattern in the surviving stories is consistent enough to be worth attention. Soldiers stationed near water at night reported a presence they could hear but not clearly see. They spoke of a shape that moved low along the surface of the marshes and rivers. They described a smell sharp and foul that arrived before the thing itself. And most disturbingly, they described what it did to the men who wandered too close to the water's edge. Some did not come back. Now disappearances in a war are not mysterious. Men desert. Men drown. Men are killed by ambush, by enemy patrols, by the countless ordinary dangers of an invading army in hostile country. A missing sentry was rarely a supernatural event. It was a Tuesday. But the soldiers who told these stories insisted the disappearances were different. The men who vanished near the water left signs behind. A dropped weapon, a trampled patch of reeds. In some accounts, marks on the wet ground that the soldiers could not match to any animal they knew. And the survivors who claimed to have seen the thing described it in ways that did not fit any creature in their experience. Return, for a moment, to the soldier at the edge of the marsh. He heard the breathing. He would have told himself in that instant what any of us would tell ourselves. A wild pig. A deer come to drink. Something ordinary. He raised his weapon again and stared into the reeds where the sound had come from. And the reeds moved. Not the way wind moves grass. Something was pushing through them, low and heavy, parting them from below. And it was coming along the waterline toward him rather than away. He did not fire. Men who have been in combat will tell you that the instinct to run and the instinct to fight are not the only options. There is a third thing that happens, a kind of freezing, where the body refuses every command. He stood there while the sound came nearer, and then, according to the way these stories were told, whatever it was, stopped. Just short of the open ground where he stood, as though the edge of the reeds were a border it would not cross while he was watching. He backed away. He did not turn his eyes from the reeds until he reached the slope, and then he climbed to the ridge and rejoined the column, and he told the other men what he had heard. Some of them laughed at him, others did not, because some of them had heard it too. This is the texture of the surviving accounts. Not one dramatic monster revealed in full daylight, but a series of encounters at the edges of perception, sounds, smells, movement in the water. Men who went to investigate and returned changed, or did not return at all. And through it, a growing unwillingness among veteran soldiers to be posted near water after dark. That unwillingness is itself a kind of evidence. These were men whose entire lives had been built around obedience and discipline. For them to begin quietly refusing certain duties, or to move their sleeping places away from the riverbanks, or to insist on standing watch in pairs where one had been sufficient before, tells you that something had frightened them past the point where discipline held. There is a word that appears in Japanese accounts of strange creatures encountered near water: kappa. In Japanese folklore, the kappa is a river-dwelling creature, roughly the size of a child, with a beaked face, webbed hands, and a hollow on the top of its head that holds water. It was said to lurk at the edges of rivers and ponds, and to drag people and animals down into the water. It was one of the most widely feared creatures in the folk belief of the period. And here is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to untangle. Because when Japanese soldiers, steeped in that folklore, encountered something they could not identify in the marshes of a foreign country, the kappa was the frame they already carried in their minds. It was the shape their fear naturally took. A thing near water that pulled men in. A creature that lived at the boundary between land and river. When they tried to describe what they had heard and half seen, they reached for the vocabulary they already had. This is the skeptic's most powerful argument, and it deserves to be taken seriously. The men were not describing something new, they were fitting something ambiguous into a story they already believed. Fatigue, fear, folklore, and a genuinely unfamiliar landscape combined to produce exactly the kind of account you would expect. You do not need a monster to explain frightened men seeing monsters. You need only frightened men, and yet, the accounts contain details that the folklore does not fully explain. The kappa of legend was a small creature, roughly child-sized. Several of the wartime descriptions suggest something larger, something heavy enough to leave a wide trail through the reeds and to be heard breathing at a distance. The kappa of legend was associated with mischief and drowning in familiar village ponds. The wartime encounters describe something that stalked the edges of an army, that seemed to hunt, that some men believed had taken their companions. The frame did not fit perfectly. Something was pressing against the edges of it. Here we reach the moment that the surviving stories return to again and again. A patrol or a small group of soldiers sent to the water for some ordinary reason. To fetch water, to wash, to relieve themselves at a distance from the camp. And the moment when the men left behind realized that one of them had not come back, and that the reeds where he had gone were now moving in a way that reeds should not move. Picture it as those men would have experienced it. The camp behind them, its fires low, the flooded ground ahead, silver under a partial moon. One man gone to the water and taking too long, the others calling his name and getting no answer. The particular quality of silence that follows a call that should have been answered, and then the decision that no one wanted to make, whether to go into the reeds after him, or to stay on the dry ground and wait for the dawn. In the accounts, the men who went in did not always come out. The men who stayed on the dry ground lived to tell the story, which is precisely why the stories that survive are the stories of men who did not follow their companions into the water. There is a grim logic to this. The witnesses we have are the ones who chose not to look too closely. By the later stages of the campaign, the fear of the water had become part of how these particular units moved through the country. They avoided certain crossings after dark. They posted heavier guards near marshland. Commanders who cared nothing for folklore still had to manage the practical reality that their men would not perform certain duties near water without protest. Whatever the truth of the creature, its effect on the army was real and measurable. Men behaved differently because of it. And then the campaign moved on. as campaigns do. The war in Korea ground through years of siege and retreat and negotiation. The Japanese advance stalled. The Korean Navy, under its famous admiral, cut the Japanese supply lines at sea. Ming China entered the war in force. Winter came and the invaders who had marched north in the summer heat now froze in the mountains. The encounters in the marshes became one horror among a great many, and the greater horrors of the war, the massacres and the famines and the disease, overwhelmed the smaller mystery of a creature in the reeds. Men who had feared the water now had 100 more immediate things to fear. The soldiers who survived eventually went home. Some of them carried the story back to Japan, and that is how it entered the folklore of the campaign, passed from veteran to listener, written down here and there in the accounts that survive, not as a central event of the war, as a strange footnote, a thing that certain men swore they had encountered, in the wetlands of Korea in the summer of 1592. So what was it? Consider the explanations honestly, because they are not equal. The first and the strongest is the one already given. Exhausted, frightened, superstitious men in an unfamiliar landscape, carrying a folklore already full of water-dwelling monsters, encountered ordinary things at night and interpreted them through the lens of terror. A large animal in the reeds, a crocodilian creature perhaps, of a kind unfamiliar to the Japanese. A drowning, misremembered as an abduction. A deserter recast as a victim. The human mind under stress is a storytelling engine, and it produces monsters reliably. This explanation accounts for nearly everything. Its weakness is only that it cannot fully explain the specific, repeated details in accounts from men who had every reason to know an ordinary animal when they heard one. The second explanation is that the men encountered a real animal that was simply outside their experience. Korea's wetlands held large creatures. Otters grow surprisingly large and make disturbingly human sounds in the dark. Wild boar move heavily through reeds and can kill a man. Large fish and other river animals can produce sounds and movements that seem impossible to someone who has never encountered them. To Japanese soldiers, an unfamiliar animal, glimpsed at night, could easily become something monstrous. This explanation is appealing precisely because it requires nothing supernatural, only ignorance and darkness. Its weakness is that these were not men unfamiliar with wild animals. Many of them were countrymen who had hunted since childhood. The third possibility is that the story is largely a later invention, that the association between the Korean campaign and creature encounters grew in the telling, folklore attaching itself to a famous historical event the way barnacles attach to a ship. Much of what we know of these encounters comes down through channels where fact and legend were never carefully separated. It is entirely possible that the historical kernel is small, and the frightening story around it grew afterward. This is the least dramatic explanation, and for that reason it may be the most likely. We should be honest that the evidence is incomplete and that what reaches us across 4 centuries has passed through many hands. But strip all 3 explanations down and something stubborn remains at the center of them. Veteran soldiers, men who had seen the worst that other men could do, were frightened by something at the water's edge in Korea. Frightened enough to change how they behaved. Frightened enough that the story outlived the war and traveled home with them. Whatever they actually encountered, their fear was real. It left its mark on how the campaign was fought in those wetland regions, and it left its mark on the men who survived it. We cannot see what they saw. We can only see the shape their fear left behind, the way you can see the impression of a heavy body pressed into wet reeds long after the thing that made it has gone. Return one last time to the soldier at the edge of the marsh, to the moment the breathing stopped, just short of the open ground. To the way, in his telling, the thing came to the boundary between the reeds and the dry earth, and did not cross it while he stood watching. He never learned what it was. He backed away up the slope and rejoined the living, and he carried the memory of that sound for the rest of his life. In every version of the story, one detail stays fixed, the same in each telling, worn smooth by repetition like a stone in a river. It only came for the men who went to the water alone,